This is Michael Stumo of the Coalition for a Prosperous America. Thank you all for coming. This is an important webinar on currency misalignment. We're doing a webinar series largely once a month on crucial topics. Last month we had Dan Alpert talking about the state of underemployment and persistent trade imbalances and the nature of them last month. This month, of course, we have John R. Hansen, who was 30 years with the World Bank and is an accomplished international economist. And the issue of currency misalignment is sort of, for CPA anyway, and maybe for many of you, sort of currency 2.0, so to speak. Back when CPA was started in 2007, and since then we've been concerned about currency, mostly in the manipulation context, in that other countries use intentional currency manipulation practices to devalue or undervalue their currencies to get a trade advantage. And that was a big problem and remains a big risk now. Trump, of course, candidate Trump was very focused on China currency manipulation. And as president, he continued talking about it when he came to office in January. However, we realized at the time, and I told my board at the time, and I wasn't that popular for telling my board, that it looks like it may be tough for Trump to carry out his campaign promise of naming China a currency manipulator on day one. That was the promise, naming China as a currency manipulator on day one. His earliest opportunity to do it would be April 15th in a twice-a-year report that Treasury sends out. The problem was, under the applicable statutes, China or any other country would need to meet a three-part test to be determined a manipulator. Number one, their central bank would have to be intervening in the foreign exchange markets to buy dollars. Number two, they'd have to have a bilateral surplus with us. And number three, they would have to have a multilateral surplus with the world. And China only met the last two and not the first one, because China was not directly intervening recently. As it turns out, the big period of intervening with many countries, like 19 countries, for example, was between 2004 and 2014, because China led the way and other countries devalued to keep up as a competitive devaluation, all to the detriment, devaluing U.S. labor, goods, and services. But yet, currencies are not resolving or trending back toward their trade balancing equilibrium price, which every textbook says they should do. The system is broken. So John will talk about the problem of currency misalignment, in that some countries have overvalued currencies, like the U.S. Other countries have undervalued currencies. Those misalignments largely explain the shape of trade imbalances globally, including our deficit, and why that's happening in the private markets, why currencies have lost their connection with a trade balance and equilibrium price, and an innovative solution called the market access charge. We have been starting now to shop this around, what John's talking about, in Congress, to educate congressmen and senators and their staff on this issue, because it's a whole new learning process to go from manipulation to misalignment. And also in the administration, we've been increasingly sending the message that all the things that you're doing on NAFTA and investigating China IP violations with 301 cases and 232 cases and all that, that's very good. We hope for strong action, but for the overall trade imbalance, it's hard to make a big difference with it unless you're willing to address currency misalignment, which means addressing dollar overvaluation, which is something we have in our control, without asking other countries to do things that they don't want to do. So John, we're happy to have John. He's very good on this subject. I've learned a lot from him. He explains things very well. So I'll turn it over to him in a moment. During the, those of you who are joining online, you should see a GoToWebinar control panel on your screen. In there, there's a place to write questions. And so if you were to write questions during or after John's presentation, then what I will do is I will read them, try to ask all of them depending on time, and so John can answer. So I'll ask him and John will answer. So go ahead and write your questions again in the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel. And with that, John, please begin.
Michael, thank you very, very much. It's a pleasure to be here in this innovative environment. Hats off to you for all the leadership you've shown in helping spread the word that balanced trade in America is critical to our success as a nation. I'm greatly honored to be invited to speak on the overvalued dollar dimension of this problem. I will try to keep the session fairly short today, and I wanted to cover 4 main points. One, talking about some of the indicators of America's economic, social, and national security problems that are based not exclusively, but to a very important degree on the unbalanced trade, the trade deficit of America. This leads us directly to the second point. The primary cause of this unbalance is the third point, the overvalued dollar, which is the primary cause of unbalanced trade. And then there's a hopeful part. This first part may seem a little bit like the dismal science part, because there's a lot of problems that America faces because of the absence of some important economic policies. But fortunately, we've identified a very important policy that can bring the dollar back to its trade balancing equilibrium level, thereby, with balanced trade, correct a number of the problems that we'll start out with. This policy solution, of course, is the market access charge. Now, as I mentioned, we just hit some of the highlights about the problems facing America because of the unbalanced trade. What do we mean by unbalanced trade? Well, basically, we're importing more than we're exporting. As you can see by this trend line, which goes back to the 70s, the average trade deficit, or in this case, current account deficit, has gotten worse and worse and worse. When I returned from working overseas, started focusing on my own country, it was in the mid-2000s, and by that point, the U.S. trade deficit was twice as large, at almost 6% of GDP, twice as large as the worst developing country I ever worked on, which is at 3%. That got me very much concerned about what on earth is happening to our country. Why should it have such a high trade deficit? Now, some people argue that deficits don't matter, that the capital inflows balance the excess imports, and therefore everything's fine and dandy. That simply isn't so, because this is debt we owe to other people. When we have to bring in capital to cover the deficit, the difference between imports and exports, this money doesn't come in as foreign aid. We're not a poor foreign aid recipient country. We have to either mortgage our assets in the form of debt or sell them. And in the process, we have, built up a tremendous debt to other countries. As you can see, back in the 70s, Matter of fact, we had a surplus. What we owed to other countries was less than what they owed to us. But with the OPEC oil crisis and events since then that we were discussing, the deficit has rocketed, and as a result of paying for the deficit by taking out debt, we have just gotten deeper and deeper into debt. It's now somewhere on the order of 50% of gross domestic product. International studies indicate that there are very few countries, matter of fact, no countries, that have exceeded 60% of GDP in net foreign debt without serious problems. Now, we have a particular focus in the CPA on manufacturing and agriculture. Here I'm picking up the manufacturing side. The manufacturing as a share of GDP, I'm in trouble with my pointer. As you can see, the manufacturing share of GDP has been dropping steadily since 2000. Here I've indexed it to 2000, down sharply, and this is highly correlated with the competitiveness of the dollar. The overvaluation of the dollar has dragged down the money we earn by producing and exporting. This impact on manufacturing has direct social and economic implications at the household level. Because when factories can't export at least as much as they import, when manufactured exports are shrinking as a share of GDP, so is the job force. And when jobs disappear, incomes disappear. When incomes disappear, it hits the workers the worst. And we see here that, my apologies, the income maldistribution, the inequalities of income peaked in 1929 after the robber baron period. They increased steadily with production during World War II. With the World War II boom, we hit a particularly good area of, 30, 40 years of relative income equality when the American dream was alive and well. People were buying cars, building homes, starting families. And then the OPEC crisis came along, and we started borrowing to cover the cost of imported oil. And the rest of the story is very clear there. By the 2008 crash, we were back to the point where, in terms of income inequality, that we were in 1929, which is a very sad story. Now, let's look at some of the problems that these numbers have created, translating the economic data into real-world problems. One of the big ones is the security of our nation. It's at risk. From an economic perspective, if we're going to remain strong, we need to be able to produce as much as we consume, to export as much as we import. And this requires competing internationally. And by keeping reasonable balance between production and consumption, we avoid financial crises. And as we saw with the 2008 crash, this is one of the biggest causes of serious dislocations, including social dislocation. The second point here. We are a nation, one, United States, not just the states, but the United States. And we need to be united economically, socially, politically, and stand behind our country in terms of defense. When incomes diverge as sharply as they did in that last slide, when the rich get a tremendously large share of the total income, leaving the less advantaged people behind. We no longer have the sense of unity, and we've seen this in recent years. We see it today, not only in the social dimension, but political dimension. A strong economy is also important for national defense from two perspectives. One, we have credibility as a nation, as a national leader in terms of soft power. People listen to us when we're strong, self-sufficient. Americans are earning as much exporting as they spend on imports. And a strong nation, a strong manufacturing sector is also very important in terms of hard power. God forbid we should get into yet another war. But if we don't have the ability to produce the tanks and guns and airplanes and computers and everything else that's needed for a modern war, we have lost our hard power as well. Now, as Michael rightly said in the introduction, the key back of the rising deficits, the rising debt, the social and economic fragmentation of our country lies to a very important degree in the dollar's exchange rate, and it's overvalued, in the fact that it's overvalued. As we see in this graph, the current account deficit in the red line has tracked very closely the real dollar exchange rate. That's a measure of the valuation of the dollar adjusted for price changes. So if we are going to avoid these big humps in the red line, the big current account deficits, then we need to get a dollar that keeps our country, our products, our workers competitive internationally. Now, some may ask, well, is the dollar really that overvalued? Well, this graph synthesizes the critical nature of what's going on. This graph is based initially on work done by the IMF, its official position, and then it's refined by the Peterson Institute for International Economics. The graph is trying to estimate the amount of change in the exchange rate, as the title indicates, the currency over or under valuation, the amount of adjustment that would be required to bring the economy of each of these countries back to balanced trade. I've gone one step beyond what the IMF and Peterson Institute has done and have adjusted their estimates to compensate for the fact that they assume that a plus or minus 3% deficit is okay. They've accepted that as balanced for years. But I've pointed out to them, and my colleague in the Peterson Institute who works on this, Bill Klein, helped me develop a formula for, in effect, moving the target from a 3% deficit to a true balance. And by this numbers, we see on the horizontal axis the over undervaluation of the fundamental equilibrium exchange rate, as Michael was saying, the trade balancing exchange rate. And the bottom right corner, you see that the United States dollar is about 25% overvalued. At the other end of the dashed line, we see that the currencies of Germany and Japan are roughly equally undervalued. No wonder we have such a large deficit. As we saw in the previous graph, the trade deficits and exchange rates are highly correlated. And if we have an overvalued exchange rate, then practically by definition, our trade deficits are going to be high. So we need to move from that 25% far right position back to where Canada is roughly, where we're more or less in balance in terms of the exchange rate and thus in terms of the external trade balance. Sorry, I'm going to get a drink of water here. Okay. This takes us into the question of why the dollar became so terribly overvalued. And basically, there's been a rupture in the exchange rate setting mechanism that existed for hundreds of years in the world. Exchange rates were set by the interchange of imports and exports. And if countries started importing more than was exporting, as we've been doing for 40 years in the United States, the market mechanism, without government intervention, the market mechanism would adjust the exchange rate of those countries that were importing too much. It would devalue that currency, so imports looked less attractive and domestic products looked more attractive. The converse happened with the countries that were exporting too much, so to speak, running trade surpluses. And the mechanism worked reasonably well for several hundred years. But again, starting in the late 70s, early 80s, this whole mechanism broke down. The mechanism that links balanced trade and exchange rates is broken. And why? Precisely for the reason you see sitting in front of you. The cross-border flow of foreign exchange. Now, countries, people within countries are buying and selling foreign exchange, not necessarily, or only a very small part of that transaction process is to finance import deficits. The vast majority of the foreign exchange transactions are to balance the supply and demand of investors for capital. And when you're balancing markets for capital, the exchange rate you come up with may have no relationship whatsoever to the exchange rate that is required to balance trade in goods and services. So this is the problem. This is the core of the problem that we face today. The international mechanism doesn't work. It's broken, and because we're not going to end international capital flows, we shouldn't. They're valuable. We need to moderate them. And the whole purpose of the MAC that we're discussing today is to moderate these flows so that they become consistent with and generate exchange rates that balance trade on the what we call current account side. Another impact of the tremendous inflows of foreign money is it has stimulated tremendously the amount of domestic credit, the amount of money that's floating around inside our country. And this chart highlights it very critically, the correlation between domestic market credit, which is shown in the blue line, and the foreign trade deficit, which is shown in the red line. I've done some calculations that indicate that most of the expansion of credit can be attributed to the inflow of foreign currency, which is like printing new money. If I borrow from you or you borrow from me, there's no change in purchasing power within the United States. But if we go borrow from China, then that money is additional money that gets injected into the economy to the extent that it's borrowed by the government, for example. The government borrows it in order to pay workers, contractors, suppliers, all of those recipients pour that money into bank accounts. The banks then relend it, and through the currency multiplier effect, because we have the fractional reserve requirements for banks. They only have to hold, say, 10% of what they receive, and they can relend the additional 90%. That goes on and on and on. So a lot of the domestic credit market expansion that you see in the blue line, credit market expansion that drives the red line, derives from having borrowed from abroad. Okay, now, how do we bring about the change that's needed to align exchange rates with balanced trade. We need to become competitive again so that our imports match our exports and vice versa. Three basic ways, and if anybody can think of any others, I'll be glad to hear about it, but three basic ways. We can become physically more competitive. We can implement trade policy reforms such as quotas, tariffs, exchange rate changes, and this be things like countervailing duties, country duties, anti-dumping duties, and the third way is to actually fix the exchange rate. And I have that in red because that's the most important. Now let's look at the problems with each of these. Physical competitiveness, yes, it is possible to reverse the inadequate investment that has left us less competitive physically than we need to justify the current exchange rate. However, there are tremendous barriers to this solution. The first is low profits discourage investment. Why is the business going to invest in new plant and equipment if there's no prospects for profit to repay that? As a matter of fact, they may not even have the money they need because they're already losing money. So that makes it very hard to increase physical productivity of existing plants. Investing in plant and equipment and skills training takes a lot of time. In the meantime, other countries are racing ahead, which is the third point. It's very hard to catch up when you're already far behind simply by increasing the number of widgets per hour that pour out of your machine. You see this problem very clearly in this graph, which shows for two separate periods. The blue is 1980 to 2000. The red is 2000 to the present. The productivity of the United States in the middle and four of its competitors. China, of course, simply overwhelms the picture. Their productivity is racing ahead at roughly 3 times the pace of the United States. So for the United States to catch up with China, to reduce the trade deficit with China, it would have to more than triple its productivity levels. As you can see from the red bar, the trend is in exactly the opposite direction. The United States productivity is falling compared to the past, not rising. This is not necessarily a moral failing of any sense. More mature countries have productivity rates that are lower than emerging market countries because the emerging market countries simply have to catch up by adapting the technologies that have been developed by countries like the United States. The mature countries, the three to the right, are having to invent these technologies. So they have less ability to race ahead. As you see from the red columns for United States, Germany, and Japan, this is a problem for all of them. And just as a footnote, sidebar, please note that German productivity is not the magic explanation for Germany's big trade surpluses with the United States. Its productivity increase has actually been less in the United States. The problem lies elsewhere, namely exchange rates.
John, I'm going to intervene and say we want to try to get done by 3:45, which is in 15 minutes, to allow time for questions. So go ahead.
Okay, sounds good. Now, the trade law options, quotas, general and product-specific tariffs, non-tariff barriers, anti-dumping, countervailing duties that we mentioned before, all of these have serious problems, such as the fact that they're constrained by WTO agreements. They're generally product by product, and as a result, they have very limited total impact. Now we come to the third, which I highlighted earlier in red, exchange rate options. Why focus on the dollar's exchange rate? Because it is the cause of the problem, and if we're going to fix the trade we've got to fix the dollar, and its link to balance trade, as I noted, is broken. And we talked already about the way that the dollar's link became broken, so I'll move on to the next one, which is the three ways to change the exchange rate. You can have real depreciation and this is part of the classic mechanism, where prices domestically fell to the point that they justified the external exchange rate. But this is the road to recession. We're fighting to get enough inflation to avoid the Japanese situation. Why on earth would we choose the route of real price deflation, pushing down wages and prices to balance our trade? That leaves us with the more attractive option of nominal depreciation, changing the market rate in some way. Direct market intervention is what we did for, basically 40 years under the IMF, where the IMF targeted an exchange rate and countries were expected to intervene by purchasing and selling in the market. Today we would call this currency manipulation, but it was obligatory under the IMF. The Berkson and Gagnon of the Peterson Institute suggested countervailing market intervention. They would only intervene in the markets when the basically when the tests that Michael mentioned were met for a country that is manipulating. So that would be countervailed under that proposal. What the market access charge does is propose a mechanism of indirect intervention. The options that we have today, we can't trust the markets effectively for the reasons I mentioned. Countervailing currency manipulation or intervention would work, but the threats are largely futile in terms of not direct currency purchases, but just the threatening that we've been done, the bashing China for years. China puts its own interests logically first. Countervailing currency would be possible, but we'd have to raise the debt ceiling, and that is a non-starter from what we've been able to see recently. The biggest problem with focusing on manipulation, however, is that manipulation isn't the core of the problem. The red line at the bottom indicates official flows. Only part of those are legitimately called currency intervention. Governments, like businesses, need to do asset management. But the majority of these flows, which are all flows into the United States purchasing U.S. securities, the majority have been private. So we have to attack the total flows. That leaves us with the one viable option to my mind, the market access charge. And then this will complete the presentation. We'll talk about what is the MAC, why would it fix the overvalued dollar, how would the dynamic rates of the MAC charge work, how would it be administered, would it be legal, how can we implement it, what are the benefits and costs. Basically, the MAC is a long-established tool in economics and in public policy and in private policy. When demand exceeds supply, you make the user pay more. It happens when you rent a car during the week instead of on a weekend, when you go to a ski resort in prime season, when you call on the telephone during the week instead of the weekend. Peak load pricing is standard. Here, in the case of the currencies, the dollar is overvalued, which means demand exceeds supply. So you place a charge on those who are trying to exploit U.S. markets. That will reduce demand. The dollar returns to its trade balancing value. And if by any chance the problem arises again, or even threatens to, you simply restore the MAC so it continues to bring the dollar back to, the flows back to levels that are consistent with balanced trade. MAC would start out 50 basis points charge on all flows that come in. It would rise in increments of 25 basis points for 6 months as the deficit continued to increase. The charge would decline if the deficit declines, and we can go into more details on that. And it would go to zero if the deficit drops close to zero or to zero. So it's an automatic mechanism, no worry about political intervention, and it sends the market a clear, consistent signal. Who would administer the MAC? U.S. Treasury. This is basically a tax, but it's the kind of tax that Huey Long wanted. I remember he said, don't tax me, don't tax tax the man behind the tree. Well, the man behind the tree in this case is the foreign speculators who are trying to exploit U.S. markets. But it is a tax, and the U.S. Treasury should manage it. It would be collected at the point of entry by the correspondent banks who handle international currency transactions. Those banks would tweak their computer systems so that with every transaction, the 50 basis points or whatever the MAC as currently is would be electronically transferred to the Treasury. And we could discuss later the different uses that the money could be used for. Now, some people say, is the MAC legal? Absolutely. And one of the joys of the MAC compared to many of the other tariff-based and quota-based systems. The IMF Articles of Agreement make it clear that it's possible, and this was immensely clarified in 2012, when the IMF issued a seminal paper on the institutional view on capital flow management. The MAC is a capital flow management tool. It's legal by IMF. OECD Code of Liberalization of Capital Movements presents no problems. U.S. trade laws and treaties present no problem because they focus almost exclusively on trade flows and income flows from the tax side. They don't focus on capital flows. And WTO GATT, no problem there either. How would it be implemented? 4 basic ways, from least likely to most likely. International IMF WTO agreement could take years. Multilateral, bilateral, free trade type of treaty. Yeah, we saw what happened to the free trade area with Japan, getting the name now, that we just withdrew from.
TPP.
TPP. That takes years and limited prospects. Unilateral action, both of the next two are possible. It'd be preferable to have the U.S. Congress implement it through legislation, which we're working on actively now with the Senator's office. And it actually could be introduced by the President under the International Emergency or Economic Powers Act of 1977. This remains kind of Plan B. I think that there are tremendous tailwinds, pressures that will push the MAC forward, because the MAC generates benefits for virtually all sectors of the economy. The business community would see higher sales, higher profits, more resources for investment. Even the prospects that with high revenues, tax revenues would increase to the point that it would make tax reform easier. Workers and families, this could generate 3 to 5 million additional jobs by moving to balanced trade for the MAC. For the government, they should love it. On the left-hand side, revenues, direct revenues, the MAC could generate billions, potentially hundreds of billions of dollars per year of additional revenues paid by foreigners. Indirectly, the tax base would go up, which would generate more revenues. At the same time, expenditures with the MAC in place, with balanced trade in place, would go down. There'd be fewer bailouts for banks, fewer bailouts for corporations, and less money that the government would have to spend to support families. Because with the MAC, we'd have welfare, we'd have workfare, not welfare. In some, the budget deficit goes down, and because of that, the cost of servicing our national debt would go down. Now, there are some headwinds that we face. Most of them are myths from the past. I'll just take them quickly in order. Market set trade balance exchange rates, we have just discussed why that is now false. Capital mobility, always good? No. We've seen in the United States too much of a good thing. Americans can dictate policies of foreign countries? No. Maybe immediately after World War II, we could. Today, we're not going to dictate to China. We have to develop incentives that make it natural for balanced trade to emerge. That's what the MAC does. Reserve currency status is an exorbitant privilege. We've had that status. It's an exorbitant burden. We can go into during question and answers why it's such a burden. Strong dollars in America's best interest. Well, strong is just a workaround word for overvalued. We've had overvalued dollars since we saw in the graphs since the 70s. It is killing our economy, killing our society. It needs to be appropriately valued, not strong, whatever that means. Final set of myths. Deficits and debt don't matter. They do matter because they have to be repaid. We're mortgaging with our financing of trade deficits the lives of our children and our grandchildren. That's morally wrong, as well as being economically wrong. Interest rates drive investment and growth. I hope to do a note for CPA shortly showing that actually investment tends to rise when interest rates rise. The quick answer is there's excitement, potential for profit. So this myth of you can't raise the interest rates with the MAC because that'll increase. You can't increase. The MAC would increase interest rates by limiting capital flows. That's simply non-factor. Foreign borrowing reduces government debt costs. Yes, but it greatly increases the need to borrow and therefore the government debt because of the problems we mentioned earlier about servicing the debt. Some argue that the overvalued dollar helps the poor. Well, it may reduce the price of a lunch bucket in Walmart slightly, but if you don't have a job to go to, it doesn't do you any good. Don't upset the market, it will collapse. The MAC is specifically designed to move within the same zone that the Fed funds rate does. The market is going to adjust, and that's what we need, adjustment. The MAC, as I mentioned, is a tried and true concept. It will be safe because it's introduced gradually and automatically without risk of political flip-flops. I mentioned the Fed funds rate. It's also moves less than the average daily euro-dollar rate moves. And as even-handed policy, there's a level playing field, reducing the risk of vested interest messing it up. Is the MAC a silver bullet? Will it solve all our problems? No. It is very necessary, but it's not sufficient. It needs to be complemented by investments that were stimulated by the MAC in plant and equipment, research and development, skills training, and it needs to be complemented by reforms in areas such as tax, regulations, and health care.
1 minute left.
Got it. Right on the mark. And there are other trade policies that could help. The Bergson-Gagnon countervailing currency intervention, anti-dumping and countervailing duties would help for specific products, and trade policy enforcement is certainly needed. The summary, key takeaways that I hope you'll remember. Trade deficits are killing the American dream, hurting our jobs, our economy, our society, and our security. Trade deficits prove beyond doubt that under current conditions, the dollar is overvalued. I cannot find a better way than the MAC to fix the overvalued dollar, and these implementation of the MAC should be complemented by supporting policies. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Very important stuff. So in summary, currency misalignment explains the large part of global imbalances where persistent surplus countries who are undervalued overproduce, underconsume, export their overcapacity and their unemployment to deficit countries like the U.S., who then stagnate. Manipulation is a subset of the problem, a little bit less of a portion of the subset now. The market access charge moderates capital flows in a very predictable, incremental way, in a way that is IMF approved and WTO legal, because the WTO only deals with goods and in some cases services.